All right, welcome back. The title of this lecture is World War I, and we're going to talk about 5 things that you need to know in order to start your process of kind of thinking and understanding a little bit about what went on during that conflict. The first is 1914. All right, there's a lot of reasons why the First World War got started, but much of it is wrapped up in the political fallout following the assassination of Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1914. When the decisions are made to mobilize and the advancements are made to begin the conflict, again, the time period of why this happens, when this happens, again, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is really kind of a key thing here. Secondly is something called the Schlieffen Plan. Now, Germany as a nation had been created in the 19th century, and by the early 20th century, they had developed a number of war plans in the event of European-wide war, one of which was something called the Schlieffen Plan. The idea behind it was, if Germany had to fight a two-front war, how would they do it? Because the Russian army was a fairly large entity, and the French army was large and also a, many ways, much more capable fighting entity. So the Germans developed a plan whereby they would attempt to utilize rail lines, they would attempt to go through Belgium, and they would attack France. Now, they recognized that this would violate Belgian neutrality, but they felt that they could defeat the French army in about 39 days, mobilization plus 39. The reason why that mattered was because they understood that it would take 40 days for the Russian army to fully mobilize. They figured that if they were able to defeat the French army within that set period of time, they could then turn around, head back east, and to go tangle with the Russians, after that. Now, the Schlieffen Plan is put into operation in 1914. It fails, okay? There are a number of reasons for that, but after German failure at the Battle of the Marne in September of 1914, you see the stabilization of the Western Front and really the creation of the war that we tend to know, that we tend to think about, that some of you probably saw if you went to see the more recent film on it, 1917. This brings us to our third point, trench warfare. War in Western Europe, really from late 1914 until the end of the war in 1918, tended to be defined by violent trench warfare. Both sides developed intricate lines of trenches. Both sides fired significant amounts of artillery at each other. Both sides then would send their men over the top into no man's land, charging at the other side, facing down waves of machine guns, attempting to take trenches and advance their lines further. Most of this was an abject failure. The lines moved very little throughout the entirety of the war, and new kinds of technologies introduced onto the battlefield and over it throughout the First World War were typically introduced as a means of attempting to try to break these stalemates. So things like the use of gas, things like the use of airplanes and bombing, things like the introduction of tanks at the tail end of the conflict. Fourth thing for us to think about would be something called the Battle of Gallipoli. Now, Gallipoli is fought in 1915. It's undertaken by the British. It is created really by Winston Churchill. Churchill thinks that he can attack through Turkey and the Ottoman Empire as a way to take the pressure off the Western Front, but in true British fashion, they're not particularly well prepared for what exists past the landing, and the Turks put up a fight, and the British commanders aren't particularly good, and by the time this campaign ends, there's 500,000 casualties for the British, and it's an abject failure. Another thing for us to note would be something called the Battle of the Somme. Now, the Somme was another very, very, very bloody campaign that reflected the nature of the war by 1916, which seemed nearly futile. The first day of the Battle of the Somme was the worst day in British history. You have nearly 120,000 men go up over the top, go up over the line to attack a sector of the line that had been shelled for just about a week with over 1,000,000 artillery shells. And if I recall the figure correctly, it's something like half of those men are killed or wounded on that day. A terrible, terrible, terrible tragedy. Either way you cut it. All right. Thank you.